The distress beacon was broadcasting in 17 languages. Clarissa recognized 14 of them. The other 3 made her teeth ache. She was 3 hours into a solo transit run when the signal hit her nav array, and the perpetual doubt was already swinging to intercept before she'd made a conscious decision. That was the thing about flying alone for 8 months. The ship stopped feeling like a machine and started feeling like an extension of your nervous system. It turned when you flinched. The source was a Vethani courier, designation unknown, tumbling slow and ugly at the edge of the Kuiper relay corridor. One engine dead, the other burning intermittently, which was almost worse than not burning at all, because every uncontrolled burn was rotating the ship further from a correctable trajectory. Clarissa ran the intercept math 3 times. It kept coming out the same. If she didn't match its spin in the next 40 minutes, the thing would be past any practical recovery vector, and the pilot, if there was a pilot, would be looking at a very long drift toward nothing. She keyed the comm. Vethani vessel, this is independent hauler perpetual doubt, Clarissa Mao commanding. I'm reading your emergency signal. Do you have survivors? Silence for 20 seconds. Then something that wasn't quite language, wasn't quite music, arrived through her speakers and vibrated in her back molars. The translation software took 12 seconds to process it. What came out was 1. Functional, barely. She matched spin with the courier in 37 minutes, which she was privately pleased about. The docking collar took 4 attempts, because the Vethani ship's collar was designed for a different geometry, and she had to improvise a seal using mining foam from the emergency locker and a length of cargo webbing that she would never be able to use for cargo again. It held. It absolutely should not have held, but it did. The survivor was in the cockpit. He, or the translator said he, was approximately 2 meters tall, with a layered membrane structure where a human would have skin, currently showing a deep bruised amber that the cultural database said corresponded to significant physical distress. 2 of his 4 manipulator arms were tucked close to his body. The other 2 were working the damaged console with a focused efficiency that she recognized immediately. It was the look of someone refusing to admit how bad things were. His name, rendered into something her vocal cords could approximate, was Serath. The damage to the courier was significant. A coolant line fracture in the drive section, a ruptured pressure cell, and a navigation array that was running on what appeared to be willpower and prayers to whatever the Vethani considered sacred. Clarissa pulled up the schematics on her pad and spent 2 minutes staring at them. "Your main coupling," she said and pointed. "I can patch it, it won't be pretty." The translator rendered his response as, "Patching is illogical, requires tools not present." "I have tools." "Not Vethani tools." "Yeah, but physics is physics." She was already moving toward the engine access. "Your coupling is cracked. I fill the crack. Coolant stops bleeding. Drive stops overheating. You fly home." She looked back at him. "Unless you want to keep tumbling." He watched her with eyes that were arranged differently than human eyes, 4 of them, slightly iridescent. She couldn't read his expression, but he moved out of her way. It took her 90 minutes, and she burned her left hand twice on components that were hot in frequencies she hadn't anticipated. The patch was an architectural catastrophe, mining foam, and a section of pipe from her own ship's secondary water recycler, and 3 zip ties, which she was pretty sure were not standard components in Vethani engineering manuals. When she fired up the coupling test, the drive hum stabilized within 10% of nominal. "It'll hold for 40 hours, she said. "Maybe 60 if you don't push it." Serath stood very still. Then, in the flat affect of translation software rendering something it wasn't quite built for, "You damaged your own vessel to repair mine." "I took a pipe from secondary water recycling. I've got a primary, I'll be fine." "That is not the point I was making." "I know." She picked up her tools. "You want to follow me back to Palace Station, or you feel safe flying solo." He followed her. For the first 2 days, Serath kept to the courier, running alongside the perpetual doubt at close range. Clarissa monitored his systems from her own console, watching the patched coupling hold, watching his drive numbers normalize. She sent him coffee on the 3rd day, transferred a sealed canister through the docking umbilical she'd strung between the ships, just on an impulse, because she always drank too much of it anyway. The translation software rendered his response as, "This substance is chemically unsuitable for Vethani metabolism." "I know," she sent back. "I figured you want to smell it anyway. Smells good." A pause, then, "It does smell good." He came aboard on the 4th day, and Clarissa had a moment of genuine uncertainty about whether her ship was going to feel too small, because Serath filled a corridor in a way that made the perpetual doubt seem like something she'd assembled from a kit. But he moved carefully, folding his secondary arms when he passed through the galley hatch, and he found a spot near the engine room bulkhead that seemed to suit him and didn't move from it unnecessarily. She noticed things, small things. He recalibrated the ship's atmospheric processors on the 2nd day of his stay. She walked into the engine room and found him 3 panels deep in her environmental systems, and her first instinct was alarm until she realized he'd increased the ambient temperature by 4 degrees. Not enough to bother her, exactly enough to be comfortable. She didn't say anything. She checked the work. It was meticulous. She let it stand. He left food near her bunk. Not Vethani food, she didn't have Vethani food, but protein bars from her own stores, arranged outside her door when she came off her rest cycle. She'd been skipping meals. She didn't know how he knew. The cultural database was not very helpful on Vethani social behavior. It said they were loosely cooperative, mission-oriented, and had a complex relationship with what translated as resonance, a state of aligned purpose with another being. The database also said that resonance with non-Vethani was considered a form of neurological aberration, treated with something analogous to quarantine. She found this interesting and set it aside. On the 6th day, the problem arrived. She was running a routine comm sweep when she caught it, a Vethani authority ship at the edge of her sensor range on an intercept course. Not for her, for the courier. "Serath." She called back to the engine room, "You expecting company?" The silence lasted 5 seconds longer than it should have. When he appeared in the cockpit doorway, his membranes had gone a color the database didn't have a word for. Something between gray and the kind of blue that meant deep water, which on a Vethani she was going to guess meant something in the vicinity of dread. "The authority has been following my flight path," he said through the translator. "I had hoped the deviation from my route would confuse them." "What do they want?" He was quiet for a long moment. One of his secondary arms moved in a small, involuntary gesture she had no cultural context for. "Me," he said. "What I have become. What they will say has happened to me." She looked at the intercept trajectory on her screen. The authority ship was fast. She had maybe 6 hours. "You want to tell me what's going on, or you want me to keep flying into a situation I don't understand?" He told her. Vethani law was explicit. Resonance with non-Vethani, the kind that altered behavior, that drove the provision of warmth and food and comfort. It was considered contamination. Not metaphorical contamination. Neurological contamination. The word the translator used was quarantine state, and the word it used for the process that followed was clinical and flat in a way that she recognized as the software declining to render something too precisely. "They'll recondition you," she said. "They will correct the aberration, yes." She watched his membranes. The gray-blue was still there. "Do you want to be corrected?" The longest silence yet. 4 of his eyes tracked away from her, then back. "That is not a question," he said slowly, "that a Vethani is supposed to be able to ask." "I'm not Vethani." She pulled up the nav screen. 6 hours. Tell me about their drive specs." The authority ship hailed them at the 4-hour mark. The commander's translation came through clipped and formal. The courier pilot Serath was to be transferred immediately for evaluation. The human vessel was to continue its transit without interference. This was Vethani internal affairs, and the human was not involved. Clarissa let the message sit for 30 seconds. Then she keyed the comm. This is Clarissa Mao, commanding independent hauler Perpetual Doubt. Serath has been aboard my vessel for 6 days. Under salvage law, anyone rendering aid to a distressed vessel establishes a duty of care for that vessel's crew until they can be safely delivered to an agreed port of arrival. She paused. Palace Station is the agreed port of arrival. If the authority has business with my passenger, they can conduct it there, through proper channels, in front of a port authority representative. The response came fast. This matter is outside human salvage law jurisdiction. You're in human transit space, she said. Pick a lane. A hold, she used it. Serath, he was already in the cockpit standing at the second station. Their drive specs, now. He gave her numbers. His manipulator arms moved across her secondary console like he'd been flying on it for years, pulling data she hadn't known she had access to. He knew her ship. She didn't know when he'd learned it, except that she thought about the atmospheric processors, the food at her door, and she thought, of course he did. The authority commander came back with something that was not an agreement and not a refusal, and was probably a more sophisticated political maneuver than she was equipped to parse, and Clarissa cut the channel. They won't push it, she said, mostly to herself, running intercept probabilities. An incident with a human vessel means paperwork, political review. They've got a bureaucracy same as anyone. They don't want the noise. You cannot know that. I know bureaucracy. She brought up the drive. Hold on to something. She burned hard, not toward them, not away, just a hard lateral burn at 1.4 G that shifted their trajectory by 11 degrees and burned 18% of her remaining fuel, and made her vision go dark at the edges for the 6 seconds it lasted. When it cleared, the authority ship's intercept window had closed by 2 hours. At current fuel expenditure, following her would cost them more than they wanted to spend. She watched their trajectory for a long time. It changed. They were peeling off. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding and became aware that her hand hurt where she'd been gripping the console. There, she said, paperwork. Nobody wants to do the paperwork. Serath was completely still. She couldn't read his membranes. They'd gone through 3 colors in the last 30 seconds and were settling into something she didn't have database entries for. You burned your fuel reserve, he said. Some of it. For me. She shrugged, which she knew didn't translate, and then she said, You adjusted my thermostat. Seemed fair. He made a sound the translator didn't render. Not a malfunction. She could tell by now when the software was failing. This was something the software had decided not to try. She left him in the cockpit and went to make coffee. When she came back, he was still standing at the second station, and he'd run a course calculation to Palace Station that shaved 6 hours off her original route. It was elegant. She wouldn't have found it. She sat in the pilot's chair and handed him the sealed canister anyway, and he held it in one of his secondary hands without drinking it, and neither of them said anything for a while. The Perpetual Doubt flew on fuel reserve lighter, patch on the coupling holding, one borrowed pipe in place of another, through the cold and the dark and the long silence between stations. The ship ran warm. Someone had seen to that. Clarissa watched the stars ahead and drank her coffee, and if Serath watched the same stars through 4 eyes that saw frequencies she couldn't imagine, and if whatever he felt in those 6 days registered as something his species would call aberration, she figured the galaxy was big enough to hold a few things it didn't have words for yet. The Perpetual Doubt flew on.